Right.
We're allowed to.
Okay. Hopefully, strongly hopefully, vote this bill out today. We ran into a snag last week, at the last minute, over the cap in the VITA program mostly, and there were a couple of suggestions thrown out of going to 2,500 or changing the fixed costs to 6 months versus 3 months. As you recall, the caps in the bill right now are 150 in the draft of the bill, 150,000, 3 months of fixed costs, or the entirety of the loss during the pandemic. So what that last section says is you can't get more than you lost. And I'll get to this further. I have a serious problem with that. You can get as much as you lost, or you have to get as much as you lost over 2 years, regardless of where you are in the process today. The bill doesn't envision that the way it describes. It's trying to help businesses that are struggling or in jeopardy. There's a section in there that talks about the taking the time money. So I met with the vice chair last night, and we had different opinions on this, and we landed at increasing the cap in 2 respects to $200,000 as a financial cap, or the lesser of that, or 6 months of fixed costs. I think Senator Robb had suggested that. Senator Mallon had suggested a higher, possibly a higher. I did. And you said
I
you were
did.
fine with the bill as it was drafted.
But I'm thinking about it. I came out last night at 6 months and she just pretty close to where you guys are.
So why don't we hand out the draft that
I think we have.
put together, and there's one outstanding issue that I feel pretty strongly about, but we'll see how that affects my vote. We have hard copies of it.
David, everybody should have a hard copy.
Sorry. Oh, this is the whole bill, okay.
8.1, correct?
Correct.
Let's look at the VITA program.
Yeah, that's. Sorry, what are we doing now?
David's going to walk us through the changes that you and I talked about.
Better yet.
Are you ready, sir?
Yep.
Okay. Good morning.
Good
All
morning, David.
5 esteemed members of this committee for as long as I've got you. David Hall, Legislative Counsel, you're on draft 8.1 on the strike all amendment to page 159. And I would like to look with you at section 5, which is on page 14 of draft 8.1. And, as the chair indicated, they've had discussions, I've made changes. We haven't really had a chance to, tear into the guts of this section necessarily. And I have just italicized and highlighted things where I want to point out your attention. They may be fine just how they are, but I wanted to be able to flag these things for you. So I have restructured this section a little bit to try to put some more legislative shape onto it.
Thank you.
And that begins with sort of organizing the subsections into subjects and then trying to really hone in on the details, right?
Right.
So subsection A, pretty straightforward, the creation. So VITA shall create this program to support Vermont businesses experiencing continued working capital shortfalls as a result of the COVID-19 public health emergency. I have this italicized on lines 19 and 20 for two reasons. One is this is the only time in this section we talk about working capital or working capital shortfalls. And, otherwise we're talking about, very specific things like revenue versus expenses, and even talking a little bit about what we mean when we say revenues, what's included, expenses, what's included. But this is the only place where we use the terminology working capital. The second is that apropos of the chair's opening, this is one of two places where I see something that would suggest but not require that VITA take a close look at where a business is right now. Do you know what I mean? This says continued working capital shortfalls. That would suggest to me that the business needs to be experiencing some sort of hardship right now when they apply. But that's not, it's a very soft sort of nebulous concept, maybe implied but not necessarily expressed in this language. It comes up in one other place I'm going to point out as well. So moving on to the next page, 15 of 70, I've broken out subsection B into what constitutes an eligible business. And so that would be a for-profit or nonprofit with fewer than 500 employees, which has to be almost every single business in the state.
Except for one.
2, located in Vermont. 3, that was in operation or had taken substantial steps toward becoming operational as of a date. So the January date.
Just a question.
Sure, please.
Before we go further. I'm still back on this term working capital in terms of how it's defined. And you could have a business that has borrowed substantial amounts of money as long-term debt, and their working capital is great, but the amount of debt that they've incurred as a result of the pandemic is substantial. And I'm not sure that, which is why I just question whether working capital is the right term to use.
Sure.
In terms of what it is you're trying to do here.
Yep. Sorry.
So I want to respond to that in general. I'm putting some deference in the conversation that Cassie's going to have with the Joint Fiscal Office and with the Joint Fiscal Committee to establish guidelines and flesh out some of these terms. I don't think, at least from the experience we've had to date on this, I don't think we can fully design or subscribe this program to be malleable, flexible, and all of that stuff. So I would assume, we could say it if we want, the list of things we want them to look at, but I would assume they would look at this stuff and present it to the Joint Fiscal.
Well, yeah, but when you start
It's a
out
good
with a
point. It's a good
definition
point.
of what it is you're trying to do, when you working capital pierce without expanding what you really mean by that, you put just a foundational issue here.
So what I'm trying to say, I totally understand what you're saying. But the same thing could be said for fixed costs we use here. What's a fixed cost? There's so many variables in a business. So I think it's more, not at the statutory level, it's more at either the guideline level in terms of doing that.
I mean, I think that's the case, but when you start out with a foundational issue that is undefined, if you don't indicate some flexibility there, I think you potentially create a problem.
Could we add to the implementation thing that and including these terms that are in the bill, set up guidelines, including but not limited to working capital, fixed costs, let them decide that, because I mean, these kinds of things could be in this short 2-page section. There are probably a handful of things that could benefit from further definition.
Right.
Probably
But-
are.
But also we're wanting very much to rely on the discretion and of VITA here. And in assessing each one of these individual businesses, which we're hoping this gives, once we finish this section, finish the whole thing. And then let's
That's
see
the
if
whole
we
thing,
think-
think about it, and then
Think
you
about
just
the
work
last
the briefest of conversation with Cassie on issues like that. is that this doesn't lock them into a definition of working capital that is not really what we have in mind.
Right.
Because if somebody's gone out and borrowed a bucket of money and they managed to do it, they could still be hurting very, very badly.
Yes,
And I don't
Sure.
want to put them in a box.
you heard that from the
Yeah.
witness yesterday.
And I have the same concern on the flip side that I wanted a flexibility in terms of need for Cassie to make the decision. I just got an email from her, she says she wants that as well. But the way I read the statute as it's written now, she doesn't have that flexibility. So I just want to make sure she has that. I think that's what everybody wants, and that's why we were attracted to Vita, because they go through all your books and say, do you need this? How much do you need? All that kind of stuff.
That again is the point that and maybe you, David, have dealt with this later on in the bill, is to provide some means of definition or definitional, the ability to modify the definition to fit specific circumstances based on the broad intent of the bill. And if the broad intent of the bill is perhaps better stated, but if we use these terms, everybody knows what working capital is. That's not what I think we want to compel people to do.
Yeah, so I would say that the reason that I raised this issue is because of the arguments on both sides that you're having, but the ERG programs are very generic in their opening language like this, and we just say businesses that have suffered harm due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then we let the program speak to what the actual effects of the program and the harm are. So I'm just suggesting that maybe here in the next place that's italicized, you consider very specifically the question of, does this mean they need to consider where a business is right now or only where they've been? That's the issue that I'm trying to raise. But so on page 15, I wanted to point out in subdivision 3, so there's the dates. We have the January date, which I believe is when the federal government effectively denotes the beginning of COVID, and March 13th of 2020 is when the governor signed the executive order declaring a state of emergency, which began the period, for instance, for the moratoria on foreclosures and evictions, et cetera. So you don't have to have a date certain, but you can. The way that the ERG program did it, remember, was to say that you were either in operation or you were closed with a good faith plan for reopening. That's how they did it. You did it back then. And this is, I guess, attempting to, say you were at least in business as of the beginning sometime of the pandemic.
Or taking steps to becoming operational, right, which we've added. So I would opt for March 13th. It gives a little bit more time for those that were just opening, and March 13th is a hard deadline that for where the governor declared the state of emergency and everything here pretty much shut down. So I think Vermonters, because this is a Vermont bill and not a national bill, I would propose that we look at March 13th and accept that.
Any problems with that?
Okay, agreed.
So section C, I have couched as economic harm, and it doesn't have to be that, but let's signal to know that there is the direction that we're going. And C1, so we're really talking here about, what does that mean? And Vita has supplied really the language that's here. It could be demonstrated by lost revenue, increased costs, challenges covering payroll, rent, or mortgage interest, or other operating costs that threaten the capacity of the business to weather financial hardships and result in general financial insecurity due to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So, that's again italicized because in my view it goes with this whole same question. The lawyer in me sees the world in zeros and ones. It says either we're looking at this or we're not, and something squishy like weather financial hardships and general financial insecurity. You may love that because that may be the thing that gives Vita a latitude to assess businesses on a case-by-case basis. I guess my pushback would be, what if a business comes and says, you know, we had a really bad 20 and 21, we're doing okay now, but we would like to make up for that loss, and Vita says, well, no, that's not really what the program's for. And the business looks at this language and says, well, it looks like it is. It looks like I should be able to get money to weather the financial hardship, and I have general financial insecurity until this whole thing is behind me. So I guess
I'm fine with this language. I think it says, basically says that Cassie shouldn't necessarily, I think it says that there's gotta be some connection to this lost revenue stuff, to the situation that the business is in, you know, if they're just totally doing gangbusters, even though they lost some revenue in 2021, they're not necessarily gonna get a grant to replace that.
I hear you, David. I also think that to be in the place they are now, they could have taken on pretty crushing debt that they're paying for now. I mean, you know, so that debt load that they took on to keep treading water may still have economic impact on them. That is, I think, allowable here.
That would be.
And I think that,
so. In subdivision C2, when assessing an applicant's adjusted net operating income, the authority shall consider previous COVID-19 state and federal subsidies, non-cash expenses, extraordinary items, other adjustments deemed appropriate. You know, there's a lot going on in this draft relative to what the underlying language is. I'll tell you why. I have italicized the words assessing and shall consider because to flag for you, I guess there's two constructs here that you could take. If I look at C2 as it stands, it does tell them to assess and consider and make the adjustments that they determine would be necessary. That could be through guidelines, that could be through policies and procedures, however they're going to implement the program. And so that's a mushier way of saying what I think the alternative is, which is, you know, when calculating revenue, the authority shall include previous subsidies received, and when calculating expenses, the authority shall exclude non-cash extraordinary other things it deems appropriate. So it's really just along that spectrum of how prescriptive do you want to be, what kind of words do you want to use. I think C2, if you feel comfortable with them implementing the program in the way their examples have been presented to you, then C2 is sufficient for them to be able to do that without needing more language or more precise process, as we talked about with the veggie statute.
But you're not suggesting that federal subsidies or state subsidies that have already been given don't need to be counted in terms of the amount of
no,
grant.
they need to be.
No, I think everybody agrees that it should. What I'm actually posing is just the construction of this this piece of law, and should it say things like assess and consider, but not tell them how to consider, or should it be more prescriptive and say, step one, revenue includes the following. Step two, expenses include the following and do not include the following.
No, I think that's what we're trying to get
Yeah,
away from.
Right.
we're trying to be less prescriptive and give Vita the latitude it needs to consider every individual business's needs and circumstances.
Great, all right. So I did add in line 18 extraordinary items, just because that's something we've always been talking about and they intend to do, but it's never been mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think Vita knows what it means when it says extraordinary items. So I did, we're gonna need to talk about where owner's compensation should come up in this construct, because the cap has never been part of this calculus. It's been a part on the back end, but I need to know where that goes. We'll get to that. So subdivision 3 here is new, because this has never been in this statute before. It's the concept of the 25% reduction. How you guys want that to manifest, you can tell me, but this is where I would suggest it go. So to be eligible for a loan, the authority shall determine that a business has experienced at least a 25% reduction in its annual adjusted net operating income So here are the variables. In calendar years 2021 combined as compared to 2019 or other appropriate base period, and that 50% or more of the reduction occurred in 2021.
This is what we talked about quite at length with Cassie. And we just felt it needed to be called out because she has it there and is going to be deploying this. But probably good to have that called out so that it's clear ahead of time. Is that fair?
Yeah, totally up to you all if this is what it looks like and what the different levers are.
So what is, and did you have a chance to speak to Cassie about this?
I got an email from her. She didn't talk about this 25%.
Because we talked about it so much yesterday or the day before, I can't remember.
Just can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't this, I think we heard a little bit about this yesterday, but, you know, we're still, I think, penalizing businesses that were new in this time period because they can't really show, they were starting business, you know, so I still think it penalizes businesses that might not be able to demonstrate that they took a big hit. And a lot of businesses were just starting at that time. I think that's what Black Flannel said they couldn't really
I
show.
thought we had agreed to address the problem that was put forward to us yesterday about people who were very much engaged in developing a business prior to COVID and didn't become operational until.
That's why we added this right
But
here.
We didn't say that. we're
Yeah.
I
also gonna
see
cover-
that, but
We're
then,
also gonna cover people who, with their eyes open during COVID, started a business,
we can't
had a
do
business idea and started to do it. So
but I think that piece contradicts this piece down here because you have to show that you took a hit between 2019 and 2020 and 2021. And you may have been new in 2019
Or not open.
or not open, you may have been taking steps to open. That cuts out,
I think you may have a valid point
Yeah.
because we hadn't been thinking about adjusting the date before, so nobody was gonna fall through the cracks here.
Well, it wouldn't have, the date change doesn't change this issue so much, I don't think. Gives them actually 2 more months to have been up.
Well, it does say for other appropriate base period. Maybe that's solution. As opposed
What
to
line are you looking at, Mr. Chair?
Line 1 on page 16.
Got it.
David, can you help us?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize the flexibility that VITA would have here in establishing what the baseline comparison is, right? So even if a business was in business for all of 2019, they may not see that as a representative year for an appropriate base and could look back to 2018 or, you know, take half of 2019 and annualize it, or say we're only going to compare, you know, your seasonal business, we're going to compare your season versus what other seasons look like. So they do have that flexibility, you know, but when you read this in combination with the date that you had to have been in business by March of 2020, that part
taking
cuts out
steps.
the businesses formed in April of 2020 or May of 2020.
Unless they were working towards that
Right.
operation before.
Fair enough, fair enough.
if you opened in December, you still are gonna have a hard time proving that you took a hit.
I'm comfortable with that explanation, because I don't, unless you wanna start saying somebody who has a business idea in 2021 and opens up should get help under this program that lost money.
No, I'm still just trying to understand how this language helps somebody who opened in December 2019.
In December 2019.
And just doesn't have the revenue to show.
Right, so I think what David's saying is VITA has the authority not to use that period, they can use another appropriate base
Right,
period.
so another appropriate base
It
period.
being March 20, 22 now. I mean,
Yes.
they started December 19. Vita has, in this language, they would have the flexibility to say, your baseline should be December 19 to December 20. And that would show us what a year of operation looks like for you as a baseline comparison.
I guess like a business opening is not a great baseline at all. You know, I mean, if you've ever tried to open a business, you're not looking at your first month of opening as your baseline. Not if you're a brewery getting started, I don't know what business would consider their first month of opening a good measure of their success.
So this is an example, if we sat down, we could all come up and there will be many, many variables in the examples that have to be addressed. We don't want a language here to mandate or preclude anything. So
Right, I
that's
just think
why we're going to the Joint Fiscal Office to work out some of the details of the guidelines of these. We're kicking the can down the road. We could design this program with all kinds of minutia and address every single problem. But I don't take offense that we're kicking the can down the road. This is a perfect kind of situation where you leave some flexibility to the stakeholders who have a lot of more knowledge than we do to work out the details.
Right, but I mean, I think we could say something like other appropriate comparator or something without tying them to their own, if they don't have a base period. I think we could make that language more flexible to allow them to be compared to other comparable businesses without saying that they have to compare themselves to their own past.
If there is no past, you mean.
Yes. If I were a business, I'd still look at that and say, I don't know if I'm gonna go through this whole process because I don't know if somebody with the discretion to say, you haven't shown a loss from when you open in the fall.
I think if somebody came forward with that circumstance, that Vita could say, well, the appropriate base period is this period and we have to use comparables. Otherwise, we can't fulfill the intent of the section.
So what's the downside of including appropriate base period or comparison or some, as Senator Rom
Or an
thinks so,
appropriate comparison.
I mean, this is still gonna,
That's past, I mean.
right, and it's gonna go through the work in the House, Cass is gonna weigh in again. I'm conscious of the fact that we need to get this bill
Yeah.
to the other body so they can do the work to finalize this. And so,
But I think our other appropriate base period would mean an individual business, and there aren't that many of them necessarily. I mean, I just don't know what the volume of business is that fits this issue. Or other appropriate base period, I think that gives Vita and the business latitude to discuss the circumstance of that business.
I think what Senator Rom Hinsdale is saying is that the base period is still looking to a comparison that may not be viable if they have to open that one. So I'm just wondering, is there some other word
Or
that we can
measurement.
use there that gives, or
Or
other,
measurement.
or other
Right.
appropriate measurement?
Or other appropriate measurement, how about something like that?
Comparable, yeah, whatever.
And I look to the attorney,
That's what I'm
maybe,
saying, yeah.
exactly, it's like, hey, to the attorney, can we do that?
I just,
David,
I think we have to recognize that a lot of businesses don't call their senator or know that they can talk to Cassie and make magic happen. They look at this and say, wow, that doesn't qualify me.
So
That's
we
a
can't
lot
in
of women in
statute-
businesses.
Yeah, so we can't statute say dial Cassie's number.
Exactly, yeah, we make things opaque, frankly, to
So
people.
how about or other appropriate measurement, David, is that
Can
to,
you say basis of comparison?
That is perfect.
so other appropriate basis of comparison?
Yes.
Thank you, David, that's why you
Thank
paid
you.
the big bucks.
I take it.
Yes.
Thank you all. I'm glad that you're happy with that construct.
You're a good listener, David.
Considered able to-
Okay, great. Let's,
So, are you ready to move on to subsection D?
Yes.
I need to put subsection headings in D, E, F, and G, I realize, but that's just inside baseball. So a loan shall not exceed the lesser of $200,000, 6 months of eligible fixed costs based on historical financial performance prior to the COVID-19 public health emergency, or 3, the amount of the cumulative decline in adjusted net operating income during, it says right now during the COVID-19 public health emergency. Should it say specifically those years, 2021, which is what we've been talking about? So let me break down that. Obviously, D1 is just a hard cap. $200,000 is the number that's now proposed. D2, issues here are the number of months. It sounds like you said it on 6 months. So the two questions are eligible fixed costs, and then based on historical financial performance. We're talking about a dollar figure that has to serve as one of the hard limits on the amount of a loan. So the question is, eligible fixed costs, do those need to be enumerated, or do you feel pretty comfortable with what we think they are? And then secondly, based on historical financial performance, what does that mean? Does that mean what your fixed costs were before COVID, or are we talking about right now?
I think I'm glad you pointed this out, because the business may have changed a lot during the period. We want to cover, this is what I'd like to leave to the VITA and to the Joint Fiscal Office to further define. We tried to define it. In fact, we did it in the ERG program. The agency came in with 6 things or 5 things, and then after they started the program, everybody came up with, well, this is a fixed cost and this is a fixed cost. I mean, we're not going to vote this bill out today if we try to define fixed costs.
But also, they're gonna be different for everybody. I mean, Michael and I talked about this last night. I mean, some people own a building, some people don't, some people rent, some people have, your fixed costs range from insurance to rent to whatever, and it's a whole range of things.
Fair enough. So I guess I would question what the italicized language adds, especially if you want to have it be flexible.
Let's get rid of it. Hey, that might take us down to 69 pages.
Can I just make sure I understand? I think, because so we're not considering payroll in that?
Yes.
Okay,
Oh, no, payroll is not a fixed
Payroll's
cost.
not a fixed cost.
okay,
It's an operating cost, but the payroll is considered earlier in the economic harm. So I mean, if there is, that will certainly be weighed in the course of the application.
well, then why do we say fixed?
Because we got to 6 months, because because it's a lot more money if you include operating costs. So
And also, the concept of fixed costs was in the other bill because people were slowing down their businesses, they laid off people and stuff like that, but they had ongoing expenses that they couldn't control, like their heat, their insurance,
the
their building
taxes,
costs.
Right, but now they're trying to hire people back at a higher rate and attract people to work again, and I don't know why we're focused on fixed costs. I'm
we're
not
focused on fixed costs because we went to 6 months. So that's a lot bigger time period, bigger amount of money.
Doubling of the size of the program.
Yeah, and if we include
But if it's still
operating,
lesser of 200K for eligible costs, I mean, what people are trying to do right now is hire people back, sometimes at a higher wage, so that they can attract people back to risky positions.
This is,
If it's an
the issue that I
eligible
want to
cost.
get to is the fact that are we gonna cover every dollar of loss that a business has incurred over the last 2 years?
You may-
We're looking backwards at this point in terms of calculating the grant. And the way I think this is written right now is we covered the period, all of the pandemic. Every dollar that the business has lost, we're gonna be backstopped for that business. Unless they bump up against these caps. Bump up against the caps, some of the bigger businesses are gonna get, they're not gonna do as well as the smaller businesses.
so,
Because they're, you have the Vermont Tent Company, which I really
Rain
support.
and shine.
They're huge.
Yeah, and their losses are
Their
huge.
losses are huge, but can we cover, $1.5 million for one business in terms of their loss?
I'm still confused if we're saying 200,000 or 6 months of eligible costs.
So either way, if they have high operating costs, then they'll do this. If their fixed costs aren't as high as this, they'll be covered here.
This is.
Right, so we're not gonna get it 1.5 million.
What's that?
So we're not gonna get, this is the lesser of.
Right.
So we're not gonna get above 200,000.
Right.
So why would we worry about fixed costs if we're not getting to 1.5 million?
Because
for
if
anybody?
you have I guess maybe David can explain this, but if you have a small company that's not up against this $200,000, are we gonna replace all their losses, or are we basically gonna replace? We could say we're gonna replace all their losses.
I mean, a lot of smaller businesses
This is a
and
very, this is a
there are a
lot
lot of businesses that aren't bricks and mortar necessarily. They even switch and helped incentivize their employees to work from home. And we're not talking about fixed costs anymore. We're talking about helping people get back to work. I don't know why we're fixated on fixed costs when the world is becoming less bricks and mortar, especially in 2021.
this is the way the program had been.
I just think the world has changed.
Well,
Why
I
are we
don't know
stuck
that
in
we're-
2019?
we're not stuck in 2019. We're also trying to help as many businesses as possible. And this is one way of constraining.
Right, but
The
we're saying
amount of
challenges
money.
covering payroll, rent, or mortgage interest. And we're trying to help employees as well. We're trying to help them hire people back. We're trying to help them when they've tried to bring people back at a higher rate because they're taking on risk. And I would like them to not just be compensated for bricks and mortar and lights, but be compensated for trying to hire people back.
Are you trying to say that because a certain business may not have any fixed costs, they won't be able to get a grant?
That's what I'm seeing
All
here.
these other things can be considered.
And fixed costs aren't just bricks and mortar. Fixed costs can include payroll to the extent that there is permanent payroll. For example, operating cost means the money that you spend to get a product sold, what you do with that.
Right.
Those change it depending upon volume. On the other hand, you may need a receptionist to answer the phone all the time as part of your permanent staffing, and that is not an operating cost. That maybe can be considered a fixed cost.
Okay, I asked if payroll was considered a fixed cost or not, and I heard no, it's
Some
not.
payroll isn't. Some payroll can be considered fixed cost.
And
It's not directly related to your volumes up and down because it's continuous.
But if we just
Let's
say
say you own
eligible
a
cost,
factory, for
what's the harm?
example, the person that you have maintaining the boiler is part of your fixed cost because maintaining a boiler is necessary to stay in business. It's not necessary though, depending upon the volume of the product that you happen to be selling.
I think we're
from
coming out of
that.
2 years of a pandemic where people's costs change. Their costs change, and what's considered a fixed cost seems to be, if we're just saying it's an eligible cost, then it's an eligible cost. I don't know why we have to put fixed in there.
Well, this is
If we
again part of
define
this whole
what they're
definitional
eligible for.
issue that I raised earlier. We have to know what it is we're talking about by definition. So look for the accounting definition of fixed cost, look for the accounting definition of the terms that we use, and that's what we ought to be talking about. And then ensure that based on that formal definition, is that what we mean? And be comfortable with that.
If we have
So look at the
defined
definition of
what's
fixed
eligible,
cost.
then why do we need the word fixed?
Because we are leaving this to VITA and JFO to further define,
To figure out what's an eligible cost.
to figure out for yes.
Okay, we're running out of time.
Yeah, and I'm concerned because the longer that we take, the second half of the biennium is shorter than the first. The House needs to do their work here, and this bill is incredibly important. And so we're not gonna get it perfect in here. We're not. Wish we were, we're not. We don't have the runway. So we've got to come to some consensus around this, and we got to move it.
Yeah, the only answer I can give to you, Senator Rom, is that when this program was set up, they had done, the administration, they say they didn't say 3 months, they said 6 months of fixed costs. I've never heard opposition to that as a problem with the existing program. It's a cost containment thing on the amounts of the grants. So we're just going with the existing program is, and, you know.
I personally just don't think that's a good, strong argument. The world has changed in 2 years. Just to say it's what it looked like when it started, a lot has changed. People have very different costs than their fixed costs were in 2019.
Well, fixed
We
costs
haven't
have
we haven't heard
changed, but
that.
they're still fixed costs. And if you look at just the definition of fixed cost, the accounting definition, the
Okay.
term fixed cost refers to a cost that does not change with an increase or decrease in the number of goods and services produced or sold. Fixed costs are expenses that have to be paid by a company independent of any specific business activities. This means that fixed costs are generally indirect, that they don't apply to a company's production of any goods or services.
That seems
they
to
can
me to
include
exclude
salaries.
payroll, but,
It includes certain payroll, it does. It does.
okay, I, as long as our intent is clear that we need to include payroll and fixed costs,
It
I'm
means
okay.
payroll,
I just think
though,
it's an unnecessary word.
Payroll that doesn't change regardless of whether you sell one widget or 10,000 widgets. Those become fixed costs.
I
If
can
you
take
have
it
to
up in
add
the house, I
payroll
just think it's a
because
really
of
poorly
that,
defined
as you
word right
add
now.
additional widgets to build, if you have to add payroll to do that, those are not fixed costs.
I think
they're
we're adding a
operating
very unnecessary constraint. That it has unintended consequences that we are not understanding right now because everybody has a different definition of a fixed cost.
costs. No, everybody doesn't have a different, the definition is very clear. If they're gonna do a financial statement, the definition is clear. It's not confusing.
So here, again, I think that
This has a long runway.
it has a long runway, JFO is gonna be involved, we're gonna continue the conversations with VITA. But if we don't get the bill to our counterparts, they're not gonna have the time to work on it, and they need that time to. I mean, that's the beauty of the house, is that they meet in committee all day, and we only meet in committee half the day, and
My
we can
God.
do these.
And the irony-
Thanks, Randy.
The irony of this whole thing is that the House has put no money into either of these.
Yeah, I have to say, okay. This is gonna be one of our biggest challenges, is reconciling the economic development money that they have put in, which is all for workforce, which we all support. But we have put this money in to help our businesses recover.
We're gonna get there,
No
we're
one.
gonna get there, I have confidence.
So we have 10 minutes.
Okay, so 3 is another alternative cap, and this just says, in my mind, and this is an issue for me, and I'll explain. This says you can't get more than you've lost during COVID. That makes sense. The question is, in my mind, and I talked to David about it, and I think Cassie has said the same thing in her response, is that if you read the statute, it's not clear, but it does set up a situation where if you're not bumping up against any of these caps, let's say you're a small business and you have, you have $150,000 in losses over 2 years, and the other cap doesn't come into play, you're going to get $150,000. Whereas on page 15, there is a reference to annual loss as, you should tell me where they. Something about demonstrating economic harm. Did you take that out?
I don't see annual here. Sorry,
I know what you're talking about. It's not the same construct. It's not in here. It's not in this version.
Well, the version I saw last night said that you have to show economic harm as measured by the annual loss during the pandemic versus pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. I don't have a problem with, making people whole for on an annual.
here it
basis.
is. It's in the other section. It says the authority shall measure economic harm by a material decline in the applicant's annual adjusted net operating income before COVID-19 public health emergency relative to its annual adjusted net operating income during. Is that what you're talking about?
So I'll see it in this one.
It's here on 7.2. Yeah, it's not here.
What page?
Well, this is in the last draft,
This is in the last draft.
because that is the formula, that is the calculation that they use to measure the reduction, which is now is basically accounted for in C2.
So you took that section out.
That particular word, yes, because
Because we're giving,
the C, subsection C is the harm, and then D is the loan cap. I mean, I can put it back up in C.
Well, I thought it was in the, first, it defined economic harm as, the definition of economic harm was the annual loss during COVID, the average of the 2 years or 1 year versus the other year. I'm okay with that if that's the size of the loan. If we're saying that we're gonna give them 2 years worth of loss, I'm not sure, this is a confusion, and Cassie seems to say that, yes, we're gonna give them all their losses for the 2 year period. I'll give them 1 year, to bring them back to the annual profitability they had pre-COVID. But I think this bill is supposed to be for going forward and not covering.
well, no, I think this part is really looking at what they suffer.
And what I'm fine with doing all of this is, as I say, not making a firm decision here and letting the group come together and come up with guidelines on these things. I think that's the path that we could all agree to, and we can move forward and vote this bill out and move forward. But I need assurances that, David, that the way this is drafted, it doesn't tie the hands of Cassie or joint fiscal at this point as to what the loan amount should be.
I don't think they have flexibility to change the amount. on
That's
this.
my problem.
Yeah.
So can we write it in a way that they do?
Of course.
Okay, so that's all you're wanting in this section is that they can't do more than
Well,
200,000.
I'm fine with the cap. That makes sense. You're not gonna give people more than they lost over 2 years. That makes sense. I don't know how you got to that, get to that, if they have that. But in terms of what the amount of the loan size, David is saying, there's no flexibility in this bill. You have to give them, I think it says dollar for dollar, everything they lost for a 2 year period. Unless they want to control the caps. So I just don't think that's appropriate. So if we can leave that if you can write it in a way that that shall be part of the guidelines to be discussed, the following sections on implementation, then I think we don't have any more issues.
So I can add a D4 that says, or some other standard adopted by, VITA in the guidelines, and that'll be left to them. But that's not going to guarantee that they don't use D3.
No, I wouldn't give preference to one or the other. They could come up with B3, but I just would maybe however you want to phrase it is fine.
Okay, got it. All right.
So could we could you make 12
I think
for 5 minutes?
I have a JLMC meeting. So
We could meet. I don't think this thing's gonna last till noon. Is it this trustee thing?
It'll go at least half an hour, 45 minutes.
so I can't do noon.
Okay, so if the rest of the committee can convene after the trustee thing, and if Becca can't be here, we'll hold open the vote and we'll have a clean copy to look at.
Expect this will just be half an hour or so.
I think so, yeah, so, no, we can come back right after judicial retention.
Yeah, but if you can't be here, we'll hold open the vote.
judicial retention or trustees?
Judicial retention.
Okay.
Oh,
very good.
Appointments, judicial appointments, I'm sorry, I'm saying retention, but it's.
Okay.
It is retention today, tomorrow is the appointment.
Oh,
Nancy,
Oh.
I
Nancy,
just sent you an
Mixed up
email.
on my
Okay.
calendar.
I'll take a look.
So we still have to convene for judicial retention.
yeah, it's done. They're making their recommendations to us to either retain or not retain the
And then we
judges.
gotta vote individually on each judge, don't we?
Yeah.
That's what we're
Tomorrow?
gonna
No,
do.
but if, I think they may do a uniform ballot.
I'm a little confused.
I'm pretty sure that's what we're doing
I've never
today.
seen us have 2 days of,
That's because we have a new Supreme Court justice that has to be,
so that's a separate day.
I believe that's a separate vote
I don't-
by the Senate tomorrow. It's not a joint assembly.
Oh,
It's
okay.
the Senate.
So we just have one joint assembly.
We just have one joint
Okay.
assembly right
So
now.
we better get going, we have to march in and so on.